Chapter 7 is on the Scopes trial. The chapter is entitled Scopes, the Battle Over America's Soul. A brief overview, which hopefully captures the essence of the chapter than the detail of the chapter itself. The next essay is about the famous monkey trial. It represents a turning point in American history, not so much for what it resolved, but for what it revealed. What did it reveal? Well, it revealed a deep cultural fault line in American society. The Scopes trial of 1925 represented the first of many skirmishes in an ongoing cultural war that really still goes on today, continues to shape our politics even in the present. The fault line of division in the 1920s was between the values of the older rural past, that is the country, versus a rising urban culture. It was a fault line between the doubter, the religious doubter, and the religiously devout, between elite or so-called educated opinion and the beliefs of the common man. And this battleground, of course, was drawn most significantly out in the schools in regard to science and religion, creationism versus evolution. This chapter deals with what many have considered to be, if not the one of the most important courtroom scenes in American history. It took place in Dayton, Tennessee. Temporarily, at least, put that city on a map, and Dayton College, or Bryan College, which is still in Dayton, Tennessee today, is a vestige of this court case. Today, that cultural fault line that can still be seen as you think even about current issues over abortion rights, gay rights. Think recently of the whole Chick-fil-A incident, prayer in public schools, and today this idea of intelligent design being taught in science classes. So what this chapter says, and what many have said before, is certainly accurate. The past is never dead, or history is never dead. Indeed, it's not even past. It's still with us today. The chapter itself begins by mentioning that in 1955, a play entitled Inherit the Wind hit the stage in America, and then 5 years later, in 1960, it was made into what became a fairly popular motion picture. The setting of that movie and that play was none less than the Scopes trial itself, and the book points out that the way that play and movie depicted it is that you ended up with a triumph of science over simplistic fundamentalist religion, is the way that it played out. What this chapter, I think, very aptly points out is that, in fact, what this trial did, as I mentioned in the intro, was to reveal a cultural fault line, particularly in regard to religion, between believers and between doubters. The chapter then goes into a discussion of the 1920s, talks about that decade in general just being a decade of transition. The new technology of the age was changing America. The telephone was being widely used, radios, the automobile was becoming, of course, very popular. Radio and film particularly were emphasized in the sense that they began to break down barriers that had once separated Americans regionally from one section of the country from the other. Now people are seeing hearing the same radio programs, hearing the same news, looking at the same magazines, etc. So you see a coming together in terms of the culture, but yet there's going to be some resistance to that. The 1920s was the first time that more people lived in the city than in the country. In terms of change, you've heard perhaps about the changing role of women during this time, the so-called flapper, the young women that would cut their hair very short, they would drink, smoke, etc. Birth control for the first time was commonly used, and there's a backlash in rural and religious America against the onslaught of these changes. It can be seen in the Prohibition movement against alcohol. It could be seen in the rise of the new Ku Klux Klan, which was more than just a racist group against blacks like the original Klan had been, but the new Klan of the 20s was against anything that was viewed as un-American. Again, a backlash against the these changes. The major or most significant conflict, as I mentioned, was between science and the Bible, creation versus evolution, and the battleground is going to be in the schools. In 1925, Tennessee passed a law which made it illegal to teach evolution in public schools. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, put out an invitation to any teacher who would break that law in Tennessee that they would provide for their defense. Two businessmen in Dayton, Tennessee, believing that a trial would put their city on the map, would give their city popularity, decided that it would be a good idea to test that case. So they put up a young teacher by the name of John Scopes to teach evolution, or to agree that he had already taught it, and indeed he is charged with breaking that law. William Jennings Bryan volunteered to come and be the prosecuting attorney to prosecute Scopes. He had been a three-time presidential candidate, leading evangelical Christian, anti-evolution, progressive leader. The book gives a good background on him. He also believed that citizens should decide what they wanted, kind of this idea of local democracy. Well, those who defended Scopes brought in a very powerful attorney in their own right. His name was Clarence Darrow. He will defend Scopes. He was in favor, in terms of this idea of democracy, of more of an elitist view, very concerned about the common uneducated masses getting their way like they were in Tennessee with this anti-evolution law. He personified skepticism. Darrow did. He was certainly a modernist in a very real way, didn't believe in small-town democracy. So Dayton, Tennessee becomes the battleground, in fact, kind of a circus for several weeks in the summer of 1925. The media poured in. Thousands of people flocked into Dayton. It became very much of a circus-type atmosphere. People bringing in monkeys, this idea that we descended from monkeys, so you got to have a little monkey on the streets. People saying that they had bones of the missing link, and then on the other hand, you had Bible preachers and evangelists thumping their Bible and preaching on the streets of Dayton, Tennessee. The courtroom was crowded, as you might expect. It goes through a good bit of detail about the court case itself. The judge first had to rule if the law was constitutional or not. He did that. Darrow tried to argue in his opening remarks about the simplicity of the Bible. Bryan preached the fundamentalist view of the Bible and the rights of the common man. It does mention a Dudley Malone, who was able to speak when the judge was deciding on whether the case needed to even be heard or not. And Dudley Malone made what many considered to be a very powerful speech, in which he argued that the Bible and science did not necessarily conflict with each other. But in the end, the judge ruled out any evidence being given from a scientific perspective. He said the question of the law was simply whether Scopes had taught evolution or not. It wasn't a debate over evolution itself. But of course, in the country, as it's played out, that's exactly what this case was about, as reports of what these people say and affidavits of written statements are submitted and published in the press. The capstone of this case is when Clarence Darrow called William Jennings Bryan to the stand. Bryan, believing in the Bible, that he was a Bible scholar and could defend it, and it ends up being put, as many would think, in a very embarrassing light, as perhaps he doesn't do an excellent job of defending Scripture. 3,000 watched this particular dialogue between Darrow and Bryan. They had to meet outside. Darrow questioned him about the flood. Do you believe in an actual biblical flood? Of course, Bryan said that he did. What about the links of the days in Genesis? You know, the sun wasn't created till the third or fourth day. How do you know it was 7 24-hour days, etc.? Bryan's more or less kind of embarrassed. He did the best that he could, but perhaps should have bowed out of this instead of being set up with these types of questions, which require a little bit more sophisticated approach than Bryan was able to give. At least that's my estimation. Scopes ends up being found guilty. the jury just deliberated for 17, 18 minutes, something like that. He was only fined $100. William Jennings Bryan himself died 5 days later. Some say it was because he was broken and embarrassed by this court case. Likely excuse is that he was just getting old and he ate too much on one Sunday afternoon. So this court case creates a backlash against those who were viewed as the winners, those who were pro-science, even though Scopes is found guilty. And what begins is kind of an anti-Christian movement that will grow, but the Christian community responds to that in a very fundamentalist or separatist type way. They begin to maybe pull away from society, to separate from society. But again, as I mentioned in the intro, this fault line still exists today. You have the fundamentalist revival of the 1970s, and of course, if you analyze the current political scene, you can see the influence of religion, questions of morality versus modern science and its implications today. That's chapter 7.